Today I'd like to do a lesson on factoring completely for my Algebra 1 Honors class. This is section 7.8 in the book. For the year 2020, this is Reimagine Time Day 38 assignment. Student Journal, page 242, and it's page 65 in our notebook. If you do not have Student Journal page 242, then you are welcome to just do this on a piece of paper and then put this in your notebook. Okay. When we are doing 4 terms, as you can see, all of these problems, 1 through 8, have 4 terms in the problem, then you always use grouping to factor those 4 terms. I have to actually take that back because you'll learn in Algebra 2 that sometimes when you have 4 terms, the problem will not work properly when you group. And that's okay. You'll learn another way to be able to tell how to factor by grouping or another method. Okay, so as I look at this problem, I'm going to group the first 2 terms and the last 2 terms. I'm going to look at each group, each new group, and find a common factor. What does this group have in common? It has b squared in common. Divide both of these by b squared. B cubed divided by b squared. Remember, subtract your exponents. 3 minus 2 is b to the first power. Minus b squared divided by b squared. 2 minus 2 is 0, so those go away. I'm left with minus 4. I'll bring down my plus sign. Right now, as I look at this, b minus 4 does not have a common factor, so I'm just going to put a 1 out here. Actually, they have 1 in common. I'll put a 1 out there, and I'll bring down b minus 4. Now, did it work? Yes, it worked, because as I look at this, those are the same. That's the new common factor, because I have created a binomial, and that binomial has a common factor of b minus 4. So I'll bring down my b minus 4. In parentheses beside of it, I'll take away the common factor of b minus 4, and I have b squared plus 1 left. And in the set of real numbers, this is factored completely. But in the set of complex numbers, that would actually factor again, but that's something that you'll learn next year. Moving on to number 2, I'm going to group the first 2 terms together. I can remember being in 9th grade and doing these problems and thinking how difficult these were. So I hope at some point you'll think, oh, this isn't too bad. As I look at this first group, I notice that this first group has a in common. And divide both of those by a. AC divided by a would just leave c. AD divided by a would just leave d. This group, hopefully you can see, has b in common. I'll bring down my plus sign. They have b in common. BC divided by b is just c. And BD divided by b is plus d. Did it work? Yes, it did. These are the same. So that binomial factors into c plus d, taking out the common factor. Into, when you take away that common factor, what's left? A plus b. Moving on to number 3. 4 terms. I should say, as I'm writing this one down, you would want to look for to start with if all 4 terms have a common factor, but I don't think any of these do. In the end, you can take out a common factor from any of your binomial factors, because it's really not factored completely unless there's not a greatest common factor anywhere. Okay, this first group has, did I write it down incorrectly? I think think this may demonstrate, we'll see. I think this may demonstrate that you don't always factor the first two and the last two. Let's see if I'm going to regroup. I'm going to scratch that, and I'm going to regroup and group these two together and group these two together. I may have written it down incorrectly. D squared plus CD, group those together, plus 2C plus D, 2D. This group has D in common. I don't think that's going to work either. This group has 2 in common. Oh, yeah, it'll be okay, I think. This group has 2 in common. Yes. Now, notice these aren't perfectly the same, but addition is commutative. So I could swap the order. This could be C plus D, or this could be D plus C. I could swap the order and it would still work. So they do have a common factor. These are the same thing. That only works with addition, remember. If that had been D minus C and C minus D, that would not work. So I'm going to put C plus D just because I like to put them in alphabetical order. And then what they have in common is taken away. D plus 2 is left. I'm glad they threw that example in there. So sometimes you can't group in the exact order that you're given. You have to change the order up to make it work. And I probably could have done it another way of grouping, and I still would have got the same answer as well. Okay, moving on to number 4. I'm going to group that's my first instinct, is to always group the first two together and the last two. So that's what I'll always do until I have to regroup. The first group has t squared in common. They don't have a numerical common factor, but they both do have t's, and you choose your smallest exponent, so t squared is what they have in common. Remember, I'm going to divide these by t squared. 5t cubed divided by t squared is 5t, because 3 minus 2 is 1. Plus t squared divided by t squared makes 1. 6 times 1 is 6. This group has 1 in common, and 5t plus 6 would be left if you divide these by 1. And did it work? Yes, those are the same. So my common factor of that new binomial is 5t plus 6. When I take out the common factor, I'm left with t squared plus 1. Okay, moving on to number 5. I'm going to group the first two together. Remember, always put a plus sign between your groups. And I'm going to group the last two together. I'm going to factor out a common factor of s. 8s cubed divided by s is 8s squared. S divided by s is positive 1. This group, this is a negative. This first number is a negative, so I know I have to factor out a negative common factor, but they are both negative, so a negative is a common factor. And 8 is what they have in common. So I'm going to divide both of these by negative 8. Negative 64s squared divided by negative 8 is positive 8s squared. Negative 8 divided by negative 8 is positive 1. Did it work? Yes, these are the same. I'll write down the common factor that binomial has in common. 8s squared plus 1. When I take away the common factor, I'm left with s minus 8. Okay, moving on to number 6, I'm going to group the first two and the last two. Put a plus sign between the two groups. The first group has 2a squared in common. I'm going to divide each of these by 2a squared. 12a cubed divided by 2a squared is 6a. 2a squared divided by 2a squared is positive 1. 2 divided by 2 is 1, and of course those a squareds cancel out. My next group, my first number is a negative, so I know I'm going to factor out a negative, but they both are negative. Their common factor is -5. -30a divided by -5 is +6a. -5 divided by -5 is +1. It did work. Write down what they have in common. And then what's left when you take out what they have in common? 2a squared minus 5. Okay, moving on to number 7. Okay, I'm going to group the first two terms together, put a plus sign, group the last two terms together. My first group has 4x in common. And when I divide these by 4x, I'm left with x squared minus 3. I wonder if that was, I have to see. And then I'm going to factor out -5. And I'm going to -5x divided by -5 is +x. 15 divided by -5 is -3. I'm going to say that I messed up. You'll have to let me know. I'm going to see that I messed up and that's supposed to be a 2 because I can't see it not factoring, but I could be wrong. But you can change yours and make it a 2. If it were 3 and I ended up with x squared minus 3 and x minus 3, then this would not factor. But I'm pretty sure they're going to factor. So these two are the same. And when I take out the common factor, 4x minus 5. And that's my answer. So you let me know if I was correct the first time and shouldn't have changed that to a square, but that's okay. All right, number 8, I'm going to group the first two together. Put a plus sign, group the last two together. This group has 3h squared in common, it looks like. 21 divided by 3 is 7. H cubed divided by h squared is h. 18 divided by 3 is 6. H squared divided by h squared is 1, or it cancels out. And my first term is a negative, so I'm going to have a -5 as my common factor. -35h divided by -5 is 7h. -30 divided by -5 is +6. It did work. These are the same. So my answer is going to be 7h plus 6. And then when I take away what's the same, 3h squared minus 5. Now I want to go back and tell you really quickly. I don't have much time left in my 15 minutes allotment. You can swap the order. This answer could be 3h squared minus 5 times 7h plus 6. Same thing for this, 4x minus 5 times x minus 3. As long as you have those two binomials, it does not matter what order you have them in, it would still be the same answer. Now, I hope that you understand how to factor by grouping.